Okay, welcome to a new feature of the China-MENA newsletter. I'm going to be talking to different authors of reports, books, different projects that I think will be relevant or interesting to you. Very happy today to have John Alterman, who many of you know is the director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He also is the author of a great new report, The Middle East View of the China Model. John, thanks for joining us on what I know is a busy week.
Thank you, Jonathan. Always good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. So can you give us just a kind of the broad overview? What is the report about? What drew you to it? What made you want to look at the China model in the Middle East?
I've been hearing more and more about China and China's interest in the Middle East, and especially being struck by the Middle East interest in China. In the wake of the 2011 uprisings, there's this sense that China was an attractive alternative to the United States. So I really wanted to understand how that looked from the regional side, what people saw in China, what they thought China meant for their futures, partly what it would mean for the United States if governments and populations in the region were attracted to China. But I really wanted to understand, as people got increasingly excited about a China alternative, what was everybody talking about? What were the Chinese talking about? What were the Middle Eastern states talking about? And of course, what does it all mean? And I think in some ways this is an issue I have been thinking about for more than 30 years. I did my dissertation on Egypt and American foreign assistance in the 50s, and there was, of course, a U.S. model for development, which changed through that period of time in the early 50s. There was an arguably a Soviet model for development, and I was the first foreigner ever allowed in the Egyptian Foreign Ministry archives to try to understand both what the U.S. looked like from the Egyptian perspective and what the Soviet Union looked like from the Egyptian perspective. So in a way, after 30 years, I'm still kind of doing the same thing. I'm trying to understand, what does the US look like? What does China look like? What are they each trying to do? And what does it mean for the future of the Middle East? What does it mean for the future of China? What does it mean for the future of the United States?
Yeah, yeah, agreed. It's what I spend most of my time thinking and talking about too. One of the things that struck me is just the idea of a China model. So you could see from Deng Xiaoping until Hu Jintao that Chinese leaders were adamant there is no such thing. There's no replicable model. We cross the river by feeling for stones. Other countries should find their own model and will help you in this. Under Xi Jinping, they've been a little more overt in saying we do have something to show the developing world. You see in the global civilizational security and development initiatives that China's more confident in its idea of Chinese solutions. So when you were looking at this, what would you say are the general ideas of what a China model is?
Well, I think the principal argument of a China model is you don't have to follow the US model. So it's almost a model by negation that the United States argues that there's, and Western governments as well, don't want to leave Canada out of this, right? But there's an argument that you have to have greater personal liberties and you have to have a restricted economic goal for the state and all kinds of things that frankly ring a little jarring for a number of Middle Eastern states in different ways. And the idea that there is a pathway that doesn't involve replicating the US, Canadian, British development path, I think is attractive to a number of Middle Eastern states. What struck me most, and it really was striking, is I did a really vigorous look to see what's the Arabic literature on what China's done, Chinese pathway, um, is there some understanding of a Chinese development model? Um, there really isn't Arabic literature. The extent to which you have commentaries about it, you have sort of 800-word op-eds in newspapers. There was a very interesting woman in Kuwait, absolutely lovely woman, who did her work at UC Santa Cruz and based it almost all on U.S. sources and wrote her dissertation in English. But there's really not a body of Arabic literature, academic literature on this. I think that most of this work is really done in English. It is based on English work that describes what China's done, and people aren't that interested in it. There's not a sustained study of it. There's just this sort of comfort that comes from the notion that we don't have to let the United States and its allies push us around. Um, that's different from having a pathway forward. And one of the things that strikes me uh, is if you're really serious about the energy transition and sort of economic diversification and all those kinds of things, if you want to think about what kind of partnership you can get from China on this, it strikes me the Chinese are happy to build things cheaply, quickly. They're happy to take contracts to build things. But in terms of the kinds of soft skills transferred to uh, a population through education, training, management development, all those kinds of things, there's really a Western monopoly on that kind of human capital development. And what the Chinese will absolutely help you build things. I mean, if you need an apartment built in a short period of time, the Chinese can build the apartment, they can build a dam. As you know, they built uh, this oil pipeline that crosses the UAE. It was built quickly, relatively cheaply, and will never reach its stated goals for volume. But that's what China can do for development. They built a lot of highways through the Middle East. They built universities, all kinds of things. But in terms of developing the skills that Middle Eastern states need in the 21st century, it still feels to me like there isn't really a China model for that states can replicate. There's a US model, and there's investment in getting people trained in that model. If you look at the people for example, in Abu Dhabi in the Executive Affairs Authority, uh, they're US trained. I mean, if you're really serious about the future of the region, yes, there's an attraction to having a relationship with China. There's a sense that these states want an alternative to US hegemony. But when push comes to shove, when you really want to figure out how are you going to do high stakes things that matter, I think there's still a reliance on people with connections to the United States, people with connections to US capital, people who operate in English, all those kinds of things. And China really isn't playing in that space at all.
It's something we've both said in different, talks that we've been part of, that there's an overemphasis, I think, on trade in goods, where China's a giant, and there's not much of a look at trade and services. And a lot of these countries with their vision development models, I mean, that is what's transformational, is they need to build these industries, they need to build these soft skills, they need to build a lot of things that you get from working with different, um, European, Western countries that are best in class at this, and China just doesn't do it. The other thing I think,
It seems to me, and you're living in the Middle East and you're teaching universities, so you see this, but it seems to me that the real force multiplier in the region is the ability to build high functioning institutions that can operate at scale. That is, even in a small place like the UAE, what you need is you need institutions that can operate at scale, that can prioritize uh, and delegate and uh, all those kinds of things that you just can't have an individual. um, that are replicable other than a Western model. Certainly, you have this top-down CCP model, which, I mean, you know more about China than I do. My sense is it's not working as well in China as it used to. Um, but I don't see that having much traction for the challenges of the 21st century, to be frank.
that brings me to another point about this. You've got three case studies. You look at Egypt, Saudi, and the UAE. Um, I think part of the attraction for the China model in the Arab world is you can look at a country that went from third world to first, in a generation. In a lot of countries, of course, development is the puzzle that they're trying to solve. And they look at China and say, you've got something that worked. Mehran Kamrav wrote a chapter in a book I published a couple of years ago where he looked at the China model. And one of his insights was not many states in the region have the high level of state capacity to do what China's done. Like, you need a really high functioning state to direct a lot of the stuff that happens to achieve what China achieved. And maybe you can see that work in a place like the UAE or Kuwait or Qatar, but in a place like Egypt, it's going to be a lot harder, right? So I guess the cases also want to ask you about, like, why did you choose the three you chose, and what maybe did you see as the differences that in the applicability or the attractiveness?
Um, each one of them is very important to China in the Middle East, and China is very important to them. I think in many ways, Egypt uh, under President Sisi has been the most betting on a new relationship with China. We've seen a lot of development in Suez Canal Zone, um, but I think also a lot of frustration with the U.S. relationship and this sense that China is a viable alternative. China was originally going to build the new administrative capital. They had a fight over money. China ended up getting the commission just to build the business district with their special ability or special skill building skyscrapers. Um, but I think that for Egypt, there really was a bet that China was going to be the secret sauce that was going to help Egypt take off. Um, it was interesting. I spoke to some very senior Egyptians with a lot of experience in foreign policy, diplomacy, and when you get them in private, they say, "Look, there's something about the Chinese society, the Chinese approach to knowledge, the work ethic that we really can't replicate." That's the secret sauce. It's not China as China. It's China's deep roots in Chinese society, and we're just not there. But that's not something the government's been willing to say, and it's not something people say in public. The UAE has, as you know, a remarkably robust relationship with China. I understand that about 60% of Chinese trade goes through the UAE. Quarter million Chinese live in the UAE. I've been long been interested in the Chinese relationship with the UAE and the UAE's relationship to China, as you know, typified by Dragon Mart, which is just a huge facility, which I visited shortly after it opened in Dubai. Saudi Arabia, I think, went through a period of infatuation with China. You mentioned the feeling of stones while crossing the river. That was actually um, on a display at the Art Biennale in Diriyah, which is something very close to leadership um, in Saudi Arabia. They openly compared what Saudi Arabia is trying to do in Vision 2030 with what Deng Xiaoping was trying to do in China. And I think they went through probably a couple year period when, at a time of low relations with the United States, when they wanted everything to be engaged with China. What do the Chinese think about this? Do the Chinese have another offer? Certainly, what we've seen the last year or so is, I think, an effort to turn more sharply toward the United States. But about 3 years ago, the leadership was very much on the view of we can't rely on this core relationship with the United States. We need to explore a relationship with China. And by the way, what we're trying to do with Vision 2030 is what Deng Xiaoping was trying to do in China in the late 1970s. And let's learn lessons. But again, not by deep study, but by sort of picking up some quotations and writing some articles and, you know, transformational change. It is fascinating. It seems to me that if you don't use that Chinese model of just how profound the change was under Deng Xiaoping, you probably don't appreciate how profound the change is under Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. But that's just on the change level. There are other places where, look, clearly it's apples and oranges, and the Saudis are much more interested in getting hedge fund managers to put money into Saudi Arabia than Deng Xiaoping ever was.
This is a really, really good report, and I'm going to, plaster it all over my newsletter. But as also just, a lot of my readers are working in policy and government. What are the big takeaways for them? Like, how should folks from the region, how should folks from Washington be thinking about China's model in the Middle East? Does this represent, do you think, a challenge to Western countries' interests in the region? Does it complement it? Is it something that we should be overestimating or right-sized as it is? What do you think?
The first thing is, I don't think competition is bad. I think competition makes you sharper. It's part of the capitalist system. I think competition from China is good. I think the nature of the American response oftentimes is the sort of one-to-one. If China's doing it, we have to do it better. And to me, that's a mistake because it cedes the timing and place of the rivalry to China. And I don't think we should do that. I think the United States needs to, and its allies need to learn how to make quicker decisions, how to be clearer, how to present clearer alternatives. I think all those things are good, and Chinese competition can sharpen the quality of the offer. I think it's good that Chinese have been really good at prioritizing what they actually care about. And certainly the US instinct is we care about everything. You know, every embassy is primed to talk about how important that bilateral relationship is to the United States. But the key countries, let's be explicit about what the key countries are and what we're willing to do. But I think Americans also systematically underestimate the strength of what the US has to offer. Again, on the sort of soft skills, on the the keys to medium and long-term prosperity are not mimicking the United States, but they're drawn from the kinds of things the United States has been building and developing for 250 years, and which frankly, people all over the world, continue to draw from. Um, I think I'm not saying the United States should rest on its laurels. I think the United States is mistaken in thinking everybody wants to be like the United States. But I think Americans overlook the sort of secret sauce of the reinvention, the willingness to fail, the creativity that is baked into not only the American economy, but I think baked into the American policy environment that I think we are often more inspirational than we give ourselves credit for being. The fact is, for better or worse, and many of my Middle Eastern friends would argue worse, the world looks to Washington think tanks to think about how they should think about their issues. So maybe my point is, coming from Washington think tank, that we should sort of right size what is the issue here and what's the attractiveness. I think the United States shouldn't be scared and trying to play catch up to China. The United States should hone its engagements to have better understandings of our strengths and weaknesses. And the most important part of all diplomacy is understand, where's your partner coming from? And I think we too often project lazily where people are coming from, what countries want, what governments want. And to me, the China's engagement in the region is successful partly because they're good at articulating something that looks very attractive to countries. And that should get us to think through, what's an attractive message? How do we articulate it? Not just on the messaging and, concerts and the kinds of cultural things that the US government does, which are non-trivial, but think about, what's the deep message and how does the United States explain to governments and publics why this is the path, this is the relationship that's going to provide prosperity and security to their generation and the generations that follow.
It's a great point to end on. John, thanks so much for this. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the great report. Again, highly recommended to everybody. I know I've shared it with a lot of people here in Abu Dhabi already. and a lot of interest in it. So hopefully we'll see you over on this side soon enough. And we
Very
can,
soon, I hope.
okay, thanks, John.
Thanks, Jonathan. Bye-bye.